Good. Good morning, all. Thanks for joining this webinar on BIRD, which is the first session of day 3 of the 10 webinars that Deloitte is hosting for you, and we have some additional webinars, of course, later today on cloud. And I would also recommend, if you're interested in joining these sessions on day 4 and day 5 later this week. Today a session is going to be about BIRD, and I am Pieter Schaap, born and raised and working from the Netherlands at Deloitte, but with a European focus on solving complex data challenges at banks, mostly in the context of regulatory reporting, prudential reporting, supervision, and credit risk modeling. And today I will be co-presenting with one of my colleagues, is Ali Khalili. Ali.
Yes, good morning, everyone. So this is Ali. I'm also from Deloitte, Netherlands, the same team as Peter, working on financial risk analytics and reporting. And my area of expertise is knowledge representation and reasoning. So I will present you the knowledge graph that we have built for BIRD today.
So today it's about BIRD, and we usually organize these sessions with a lot of opportunity for interaction. And well, given that this is a cross Europe webinar, the options are a bit limited, and we only have just an hour. So please, if you have any questions, shoot them to us through the chat, and if they fit in a storyline at the time, and we will be happy to answer them. If not, we promise to follow them up if you want after the meeting and get back to you later today or after today with an answer. So we have basically 4 topics on BIRD that we like to go through. First of all, well, a bit of context, why BIRD and why it might be needed. So I'm going to step back a little bit and share a bit about context in relation with PEDAR. Second part is going to be about BIRD, what it is and what it's not. Then I think the more interesting part is going to be in section 3 for those that haven't seen BIRD. On 3 we are going to zoom out of BIRD through the eye of a bird. Basically, we are going to unpack the package that you can publicly download from the ECB website, and also zoom in and show you actual working pieces of what's in the package and what you could potentially do with the BIRD, and hopefully that is going to inspire you. And we are trying to close up with a strategic view on BIRD and our personal view on potential next steps and the likelihood of this being a solution for our clients. Good. So questions please in the chat box, and because you are muted and we cannot change that given the size of the audience. Well, to take a step back a bit, if you look at BIRD, BIRD stands for the Bank's Integrated Reporting Dictionary, and if you look at the goals that the ECB shared about BIRD on the website, it's about solving data quality challenges, among other goals. One of the topics that the ECB would like to achieve with BIRD, which is interesting because PEDAR, which is also about data quality, was issued years ago. I think it was somewhere in 2013, where the BCBS issued a set of principles that banks, especially the tier 1 banks, needed to comply to. And the question is, what is their current state of their data management, and why would BIRD still be needed, given the fact that PEDAR has already been applicable for them for about 8 years. So at Deloitte, our colleagues did a survey. We do that once every year across different financial institutions across the globe, and basically, we ask them to give feedback and their view on their current state of data management. And in this case, I took a snippet out of the survey, which is about TRIM findings and their view on TRIM findings. So this is from clients. And based on these findings, we see that actually, banks around the world believe that about at least 90% of respondents, and even a bit more, feel that or share that TRIM investigation and findings that were shared by the local supervisory teams are about data management, data quality processes, which is interesting because internal model-based banks, they had to comply with BCBS principles for quite some time. That and still after 8 years, these findings pop up, and it's not going away rapidly in our view. And we also see that clients, if you ask them what is their key concern at this moment, it's mostly about availability of data and quality of data. And even almost 50% of the clients is concerned about the quality of their data management, which is quite a big number. And if you take a step back, and this is from our personal experience, is why is this difficult? Considering it's been 8 years. Well, it's difficult in our view because data driven, when becoming a data driven bank, touches every aspects of the bank, and especially banks that have a long reputation and a considerable amount of history. There's a lot of legacy involved there in terms of processes, of IT, on data structures. There are people that are used to work in a specific way that you need to change. You need to attract the right talent, and that all combined with the continuous flow, of course, of regulatory changes that continue to being issued towards the banking industry. And of course, clients that need to be serviced properly along the way. So, changing all these aspects at the same time and changing the fundament of the bank is hard, which is why it's taken so long in our view. And the data management and risk and reporting processes are in that case no exceptions, as just one of the processes that need to transform to being more data driven. And that's not only because reports need to be, are increasingly more granular, and banks need to be able to substantiate how these reports were produced. So, if an auditor knocks on the door, you need to provide the proper evidence on how you came up with specific numbers. So that's about documentation, it's about lineage, it's about audit trails that need to be put in place. But it's also about risk management, where banks are increasingly challenged by themselves, but also by stakeholders to play more direct on the ball. So being more responsive on a day-to-day as well on risk that occur in the business outside and inside. And for that you need to have proper data management in place. You need the availability or timely availability of data of a specific quality. And if you look at the reporting process, that's pretty big, even though it's a small aspect of a bank. You have source systems, you have different data integration and management processes, typically being filled in by warehouses, by report application, either bespoke, created by a bank, a manual solution, and user computing. But we also have, of course, a lot of vendors that work in this space. And you need all those components to work together in a smooth manner to produce reports. And ultimately fill in here on the right, visualize in this slide those report requirements. So having a focus on all these aspects of a bank is quite cumbersome and requires a lot of talents and capabilities that you need to have on board as a bank to be able to respond properly when changes occur. So the question is, these processes are difficult and cumbersome to change if new requirements pop up. We've seen that over the past 8 years since PEDAR was issued that progress has been made, but it's not as I think a lot of people would have expected. And the question is, are banks on the right track, and can they continue in this space, or is somebody going to force them to increase space for whatever reason? And here potentially BIRD can come into play, because we feel that BIRD might just well be an option to consider doing things differently to speed up and to regain focus within the bank towards what's truly meaningful is the added value that banks bring ultimately to their clients. So that brings on us on the BIRD. I'm sure that a lot of you have read publicly available information about BIRD, and one of the topics that's always covered in relation to BERT, especially if you ask people around the ECB. That's the concept of the integrated reporting framework, and that's well, it's abbreviated as IREF in this case. And the two are sort of linked because the ECB is one of the key players in this space, and also IREF could be an opportunity to really kickstart finally this BERT initiative. But there's a key difference in my view, and that is one of them is that IREF describes a data set that ultimately needs to be delivered by the banks, containing statistical information. And it's basically going to be based on publicly information that the ECB has shared, a combination, an integrated model covering basically all the requirements or the key requirements that currently need to be filled in by the European focused banks. So, for example, security holdings requirements and unaccredited requirements and a few others are going to be combined in one integrated reporting set, and hopefully if, then at some point in time going to release people and reduce costs also at bank, because filling in one requirement that covers 4 statistical data sets being integrated to one is cheaper than doing 4, obviously. So IREF is about what you need to report, and BERT, you could summarize this, that BERT is about how you need to produce a report. And because this how question is up to the supervised banks, it's not mandatory, but it's something that you can adopt voluntarily in the way of working, hopefully easing the way that banks, that you as a bank currently implement regulation. So that's a key difference between the two. And if you then step into what is BERT, would be the question. If it's about easing and facilitating implementing changes, how can it facilitate changes? Well, we will dive into that a bit in a few minutes, pretty deep, and hopefully we'll giving you some tangible examples about how this could work. But in essence, the BERT contains a list of data requirements, definitions, metrics, also data models, which all the data elements and requirements are sort of structured and combined, and that all structured in a sort of architectural layer model in which all supported reporting requirements, and that includes form reports such as FINREP and CODAP, but also data sets such as unaccredited. They are all linked back basically to one layer. That's how the BERT team calls it, which is the input layer, with the idea that if you have one input layer and you map all the bank system towards that one input layer, that is sort of integrated and enforces consistency of the data by design, then it could very well be an option to leverage that to reduce different potentially redundant processes at the bank that are currently being used at a lot of clients that we see, producing different processes by different teams and by different IT applications. So BERT comes with these data requirements that are pre-populated and pre-interpreted based on a regulatory framework. So it's somewhere between the regulatory framework and the actual implementation, because different steps in the implementation, like creating a working piece of software, doing a physical data model design, and creating the actual ETL mappings as an example. Those are steps that you still need to make if you were to implement BERT based on the ECB vision. But the first steps in a design are basically pre-filled and could be seen as an accelerator. Good. Well, then in summary, we have the scope. That's about statistical reporting, integrating reporting requirements on the European level, getting rid of, if I summarize it bluntly, of specific local statistical requirements and integrating them in a European framework. And it's a data set that any bank that falls into scope needs to comply with at some point, and that's probably between 24 and 27. That actually in European terms, that's pretty close by in my view. And BERT is about how best to implement those reporting requirements, and that covers IREF in this case, but it would also cover prudential reporting and also resolution reporting, and in time would be our expectation. And the obvious advantages would then be reducing reporting burden, creating one process that delivers all the reports, and reducing time and effort at banks. And in my view, perhaps even more importantly, it's about bringing management attention and resources back to the core added value of the bank, which is the client, instead of reporting. Reporting, in my view, is mostly filling in the requirements to be able to operate in the market, but no added value. Good. Then let's
Maybe
try to have.
Peter, I see one question in the chat. So, which is it possible to see slide 6 one more time? I think that the TRIM findings.
Yes, of course. I can go back quickly. Yes, and what is the question then?
I think they just want to see the overview. Okay.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, I think the organization is going to share these slides with the audience. So that would include this slide as well. And anybody in the audience that has wants to have more insights on the substance about underneath these findings, we'll be happy to share them, because most of it can be publicly shared. Does that answer the question, Alan?
Yeah, I think so. But feel free to share your questions via chat, and then we make a pause after sections to hopefully answer your question.
Good. Well, let's try to get a bird off the ground here. First, starting with a look inside, and hopefully you all can see that through the screen share. The idea, this is sort of an architectural overview filled in with some artifacts that we've taken from the bird release package. It is publicly available for anybody. So quickly, I want to take you over this quickly. You start with data from core banking systems, which can be any type of system, so loan systems, collateral systems, asset management, treasury, whatever it is. Those data, or those systems feed data into what we call an input layer, and there are various approaches, of course, to do that. And this input layer is what I just called sort of an integrated data model that forces consistency by design. So you need, as a bank, to ship data to that model and validate, some type of consistency and quality before you are able to ship it in the input layer. Otherwise, it's probably going to be rejected if you were to physicalize this one. But if you have then this data in this input layer, then a bird comes, well, sort of prepackaged, because prepackaged sounds a bit like it's working software, but it's not. It's a set of requirements, basically. But all the processing steps that need to be made to transform, enrich, and process this data ultimately to a report. And in this case, we put a FINRAP icon here, is predefined in BIRD. And there are different steps that bring data from the input layer to what the BIRD team calls an enriched input layer, subsequently to a reference output layer, and then a non-reference output layer. And well, it's probably we don't have the time to dive into that too deeply. But the core here is that based on BIRD, any pop in principle, if BIRD is completed, any data point that's on a FINRAP is predefined. At least, and mostly all points in the FINRAP are predefined, in terms of how they relate to the input layer and vice versa. And the same, of course, would apply to other reports that would be in scope. I just corrected myself because there are a few different type of reports that are not in scope of BIRD, and actually for a reason. And I will give an example. The forms that I typically start with when I have a look at the client's FINRAP is typically form 101, which is the asset side of the balance sheet of a bank. And mapping that side of the balance sheet is usually a mapping between FINRAP, the data point model that's feeding the FINRAP, and specific general ledger structures that the client has. And typically those structures are custom for clients. So BERT, and this is the example, BERT does not contain predefined mappings for general ledgers. That's something that's client specific. You cannot do that. But on any place where you can have it predefined, standardized to a large extent, because it can be shared across all banks. Those schedules and mappings should be part of BERT. Good. But then the question is, how can we put it to use? Because if you look at the BERT website or the subsection on the ECB side, you can download the package. And the last one, it's a few gigabytes of a zip. You open it, you get a huge access database with thousands, if not tens of thousands, of different rows. And to be honest, the documentation is still pretty scarce. So you need to have, you spend a bit of time on understanding what's really inside this access database. So this is an effort that Ali and I, together with some of our team members, picked up over the last few months. We asked ourselves the questions: how can we put BERT to use? Because the ECB shares, you can use this. That's our intention, to facilitate your process. But there's no documentation, or it's scarce, and there are no tools, that can help you put it to use. So we tried that out, and we basically took two approaches after having some discussions in our team. On the right side, that's B. We created a small, engine that we used to validate whether or not it's possible to extract a working report application, basically, directly and automated by the rule set and the definitions that are pre-populated in BERT. So let's imagine you have BERT, you create a piece of software that transforms BERT into a working software code. Would you then be able to produce reports that make sense based on the output? Well, and of course, given that BERT is not complete in terms of scope, given that and that there's some other pointers that you can make and comments you can make, but in essence, we were able to produce a working piece of software out of it, and we validated it by producing a few FINRAP, asset encumbrance, and unaccredited data sets / templates out of that. And it was actually very interesting, the concept of having a sort of community-based data model and requirements that you can use to automatically create working software, and that could potentially open up doors to new business models that are going to, and that could potentially have a huge impact on our clients, but also on established vendors, as an example. So that's B, and we will be happy to present that. But what you would see, is FINRAP templates presented on the screen. You will see some input data sets. So it's not really something that's very interesting to present at this point. So what we are going to present is basically case A, question A that we asked ourselves, and that was more in the supporting process. Now let's suppose that the bank has an established process that brings core data from a client's core banking systems to a report, and something changes in those reporting requirements. How can BERT facilitate, adapting that existing process? So that's why we started with A. So the typical challenge that we saw there is, can we see the impact of a change easier? Which layer is impacted? Which business domain is impacted? How are different changes connected in a process? That's where we had a look at, and we would like to show you a bit about that. Ali.
Yeah. Before I start the knowledge graph part, there I see a question from the audience, which is, will BERT cover under common umbrella or will replace in full existing reporting requirements like unaccredited?
Yeah. The current scope of BERT includes the complete, integrated reporting framework scope. But that is the 2B scope, that's in 2024, because RF is not completed, and the current scope includes unaccredited, as an example, fully.
Yeah,
Any
I
other
hope
question?
this. No, that was the only one. Yeah, so what we did was, in order to see BERT in the whole picture of data-driven regulatory reporting, so we made a knowledge graph to connect all the relevant concepts for data-driven regulatory reporting. And as you see in this picture, BERT already covers a majority of concepts in the whole process, from data to ETL, data flows into rules, and then at the end towards reports. And in our knowledge graph, so we try to enrich BERT with some additional context. So we added the EBA DPM model. So we added regulations from one of our tools called RegMiner, and we build a knowledge graph at the end to better understand the whole ecosystem of the BERT. And a knowledge graph, in essence, is just a means to represent knowledge in a domain of interest using a graph structure. So we process the data from BERT, try to interlink it with DPM and regulations, and then at the end, we created a network structure of interconnected entities that will give us some capabilities. So if you go to the next slide, so then we can see a quick snapshot of our knowledge graph. So what you see here is like at the bottom, you see different layers of the BERT, from input layer, enriched input layer, reference layer, to the non-reference layer. And the brown circles you see here are high-level ETL processes. So the transformation schemes, as it's called in BERT. And this is just the high-level one. We have really detailed levels of those transformation schemes. The blue circles are basically tables or data cubes that are filled or modified by different processes that we have. And then on the right-hand side, the green dots that you see are reports which are generated, which belong to different reporting groups. So this is just a quick bird's eye view on the BERT. But now I'm gonna show you actually this in action. So in the application that we built. So let me switch to my screen. Yes. I hope you can see my screen. So that is a tool we developed at Deloitte called a Graphiport, and this is our analytics dashboard on top of the knowledge graph that we built for BERT. And as was already explained by Peter, the whole idea is to have a bird's eye view on the process of data-driven reporting, regulatory reporting. And what you can see here is we have imported different types of reports from EBA DPM. So if I go to FinRep, for instance, so you can see all sorts of reports. So if I go to, for example, F2001, geographical breakdown of assets by location of the activities. So you see different rows and different columns of that report. So I can select that specific report. So it goes to my data card, so I can see that report here. And then I can see the BERT process to generate that report. So that's what we call a recipe. So we are basically querying the knowledge graph that we have built to project part of the knowledge graph, which shows the BERT process for the given report that I selected. So when I run that recipe, so basically what you see here is a graph where we see different types of entities. So this is the report that I selected. And these are the black circles you see are different layers of BERT. And then the brown ones are high-level transformation schemes. So you can see that if I zoom in a bit, so we have, as in the input layer, we have a table, cash on hand, and which consists of different columns, as you see here. So this is basically the input layer where you need to connect your source data to. And then it goes actually across different processes here, as you see. So if I click on one of them, you can see this is a process to prepare the cash of hand. So it enriches the data and then adds it to another table that you see here in BERT with this the E postfix here. And at the end, so you go to the non-reference layer, so where you build a cube, which is geographical breakdown of assets by location of the activities. And that cube, as you see here, consists of different columns. And that will be fed into the report that you get, which is this one here. And the interesting thing is if I go back to reports and then if I select another report here, so let's say this F401, which is another breakdown of financial assets. So I just select that one. And now if I go back to the graph and see the process again, so you can see the outputs of those two reports, and you can see the overlap between the ETL flows here. So you can see that there are some common transformations happening here, and then you see two branches that are going to generate those two different reports. So you already get some insights on dependencies or redundancies of the processes you have. And if I zoom in a little bit more, so because I showed you just one level, the transformation schemes. So if I go one level deeper, so to show you also the transformation itself, which has a VTL code. VTL is the representation of the ETLs in BERT. So now you see all these orange dots, which are sequence of actions related to a certain transformation scheme. So if I select one, which is this one, generation of the unfolded version of the cube, this cube. So that already consists of several steps, and you can see those steps. So if I click on any of them, so you can see the description of that ETL transformation, and this is the VTL code. So which you see consists of different data elements, and you can actually zoom in also to that one to see more details of all the components which are required to basically do that transformation. And also to show you a different view on those ETL flows. So you can already see here the phases in BERT from, for example, input layer to enriched input layer, and then the end, for example, from reference layer to non-reference layer. And we have the transformation schemes, we have the transformations themselves, and then you have components of the VTL that you see in the transformation itself, the node. And there are also some with no phases, which are basically functions which are shared among all the other processes that we see here. So now, because I mentioned also the regulatory side, so another interesting aspect is if we add the regulatory dimension to BERT. So if for the forms that I selected, if I ask to show also the regulatory lineage, so here you will see an example from this F2001 report, which has a row called derivatives hedge accounting, which refers to IFRS 9621, which is a regulation. And then we see actually on the left hand side, we can see basically the regulatory lineage. And this part comes from our RegMiner tool. So you see different sections of the regulation, the IFRS 9 regulation, and then you even see other relevant regulation, which in this case, IAS is relevant, and we have another one. And for users, if interested, you can also zoom into that particular regulation and, for instance, go to the RegMiner tool that we have. So here, when I zoom in, now I can go to the exact text of the regulation, which is mentioned there. So which helps to also check the compliance with that regulation. And let me see, going back, I want to show you maybe one more part, which is what we are currently developing, which is the semantic search part. So you can ask some sort of questions from the knowledge graph that we have built, for instance, to get the regulations driving certain reports. So you can just run that query, and then again, it just queries the graph, and then you will see the results about that specific report. Or we can do maybe one more example, which is, for example, how does DGS ties to FinRep? So you want to see the connections across different types of reporting that you have, and this tries to find, the processes which are reused among those reporting. So Peter maybe can give more context on the DGS side, but I'm just showing one process, example process shared between those.
Yeah. Ali, perhaps if I may add, just for clarity, is the DGS link, so that would be the Integrated Customer View, ICV, sorry, and DGS. That's also European regulation, but also amended by the specific nationalities. In this case, what we put in is European a bit plus specific Dutch regulation, and we added that to this BERT content package that Ali injected in his graph model as a basis. So to be clear, DGS is not part of BERT yet at this point. This is something that we added to experiment with basically how we could put BERT to practical use.
Yeah. So, and maybe just one last, because I want to also show one example recipe on the analytics side. So, let me just select actually one example report, and then for that report, so you can also get some insights on the critical data points, which are, the data points which are important to generate that report. So when I run that recipe, so we run some AI and graph analytics behind the scene. So that's why it takes a bit long. And then we can generate some insights on, for instance, in this case, we have a certain table which gets a high score here in terms of centrality. And then, you can also combine this information with the graph view that you see. So to, for instance, in this case, to take care of the quality of data in that table. So with that, I think let's switch back to the presentation view.
Yeah, well, Ali, just wait a bit. I have a question here from the audience, which we need to answer. The question is, could the graphic report application be integrated in a core banking system such as FlexCube, or is it meant to be standalone?
Oh, I think I don't know about FlexCube, but in essence, graph report, so you can build a graph, a virtual graph, which is an overlay on top of your existing data infrastructure, and then you get the, what I presented here.
Yeah, and well, I think hopefully that answers the question, because, well, to add, this way of looking at your data management landscape is about diving in and analyzing basically the design of your data management processes. So you're creating an analytical environment of all the documentations on metadata definitions and data management process, how they are related. And you could combine them with the actual data flowing, so that you have a combination of the design and the execution integrated in one analytical environment. So perhaps, Ali, if a client were to do that, if you were to integrate what is it, actual data that's being fed in the reporting process and how it flows through the reporting process, and the design of the process that you just showed, where would you see that in the application?
Yeah, I think that's, I give you, let me go back to the example from BERT, because I think there because the example I gave you was just the mock-up information, so because I don't have actual data here. But what you see here, so if I select this table cash on hand and I click on that, so you should be able to see your, the actual data here. And then when you click on the notes, so you can see how this data flows, like through those processes.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. But since this is a prototype application, and it's not yet, a minimal of our product, in this case, this layer has not been integrated. And we've used snippets of what Ari has just shown at several engagements across Europe to help clients visualize metadata lineage, basically, and putting it to use. And you can imagine that in this case, we use it for BERT, but after having it done for BERT, we also found out that it can be pretty usable for other use cases that are basically about shipping data from the left to the right, and where you need to get a grip on what's happening in these processes. So this is about bringing an analytical view on that documentation. Good.
Yep.
I have another question about scope, which I will about CoRep, and I will get back to that in a few minutes. Shall we switch back to the presentation with my screen? Good. Well, we just showed some, well, at least practical use cases for BERT that you hopefully can gave you a bit more practical view how you can put it to use, and some things to think about, how to optimize and change the current way that you approach these type of challenges in your current position or at clients. And for us, the question was, after having experimented with this BERT content in this way, what could be now potential next steps? How can we really put it to use? And what's new in that? So the first one will be, and Ali already touched on that lightly. This is about regulatory lineage and metadata lineage. This is a requirement that's banks are typically challenged on increasingly from different stakeholders to document and be able to evidence also that they have lineage in place. But there's no real practical example on how to visualize lineage and what the best practice is. Well, that combining BERT content with a knowledge graph, I think has showed us that this could be a way to easily document lineage and be able also to evidence to different stakeholders that you as a bank have complied to that. And if you are able to do it in this way, and let's suppose you can use an out-of-the-box from-the-shelf content asset such as BERT that contain all the data definitions and requirements that you would need, it would probably also save banks a ton of money, because they can cut out huge parts of the scope of their current data management and data governance processes, because all these documentations on requirements and how they tie together can be shared by banks, so it can be leveraged in one model, and then everybody can benefit with this type of view. So this is one way to go. BERT as an accelerator and to making the steps in an efficient way and providing a lineage documentation, and also reducing cost across banks, because lineage can be shared across banks, because everything is generic to a big extent. The second part, which is also interesting, let's suppose there's a data quality issue. There's some type of trigger going off that needs to be followed up in the data collection process, and you need to assess how to prioritize such a trigger that's going off. And by placing an individual, being able to place an individual data quality trigger as an example in the context of your whole data and reporting process, it's much easier to pinpoint the critical data elements, not on theory but actually in practice, and focus on those issues that really are significant for the end reporting process, And you can then, and if you do it in this way, you can substantiate also why you've chosen that specific point, because you have derived it from the actual data. So it's fact-based, it's not human reasoning anymore. So being able to do these type of analysis, putting machine learning and AI models on top of it, that's a huge potential in our view, that we could leverage. But the key requirement would be that the BERT asset base comes to maturity, and that we get a sort of minimal viable product that banks can leverage on in the end to kickstart these type of innovations. So then we come to the business case of BERT in our view. One of the key issues that we see in BERT is that it has taken the BERT working groups quite a few years to come to the point where it currently is. And the BERT scope is far from complete. So at this point, it contains FinRep and even a deprecated version of FinRep. I think it's even 2.6. So that feels like ages ago for the practitioners on the FinRep side. And CoRep, that's one of the questions that was shared with the audience in the chat. CoRep is also in scope, so it's going to be integrated, but it hasn't been included yet. So it's on the timeline. And then you would come to a point that you have one input layer that feeds into FinRep, it feeds into CoRep, and that's the core CoRep, but also, for example, the liquidity parts. You have the statistical data sets linked to that input layer. So you have a really consolidated data set that ultimately feeds all these different frameworks. And it isolates then the bank from the complexity of different supervisor regulators collaborating and creating their own report requests to banks versus integrating from the framework design. And banks can focus on the single input layer because they're sort of isolated or abstracted from this type of complexity. So scope is one part, and another important part in our view, the key part, is finding a sort of launch in bank. And we are having conversations with different banks across Europe to see if they will be interested, and we can help them make a business case to kickstart this first BERT implementation, because the BERT community needs actual practical experience and implementations to get proper evaluation cycles that feedback into the BERT content, so that you can get a sort of maturity loop, and then the BERT content can grow. That's one area. And I hope that we will be able to succeed in that in the next 6 to 9 months, so that we find the bank that's willing to innovate and help take this to the next level. And lastly, we think that the incentive model about the BERT community needs to be reconsidered in a way. Currently, the BERT is seen as an ECB working group by many outside stakeholders. There are different industry participants for the banking industry, especially SSM banks that are part of those working groups. We have some older stakeholders, such as consulting firms like Deloitte, that are also at times invited and can contribute in the end. But the overall responsibility in terms of quality management, as an example, and the governance on who decides on priorities and key issues, that is not clear and not clearly communicated. So it's not transparent enough in our view. And we also think that it needs to be improved, so that the next timelines that are shared by the working group can also be filled in realistically, which is, of course, important. So these are different topics that Ali and I and the team will have conversation about with different of these stakeholders to see if they can also play our role in bringing BERT and the BERT content and the working group to a next stage, and see if everything we have learned can be brought to a real client to innovate in this space, and see if this can change the way the banks process new regulations significantly, and so they can be helped to regain focus on the clients instead of compliance issues. Good. Well, are there any questions Because I think we have covered all in the chat.
Yeah.
And I don't see any others coming in at this point. So if there are any, no new questions I see. Well, if there are any questions after the meeting, please feel free to share them with us. So we'll be happy to follow it up at a later point. And for those that are interested, we are planning to do a more BERT deep dive, where we actually take clients, but also Deloitte colleagues in a combined session more into the details on how these models work and how we engineered from a content perspective all these graph models. That's something that we are going to do in Q3, Q4 this year. So if you're interested, you're free to and very welcome to join those meetings. I have a question here, Ali. When it comes to talents in-house to implement and maintain a BERT model, how can the small banks focus? Data teams are scarce and overburdened. Yeah, well, the idea, at least the idea that we have behind BERT, is that BERT is a collection of content, artifacts, that need to be transformed to working software code, and that's the transformation part to the engineering part is out of scope of the BERT group. But what we believe that there will be companies that will pick up these models and create working software out of this, so that smaller banks, but even the larger banks, but especially smaller banks, can just use out-of-the-box software solutions that are BERT-based and BERT configured. That's basically the answer. So that data teams in smaller banks don't need to focus on getting report transformations and mapping right. They can focus on getting the data from the core systems towards this solution, and for that you need actual client and bank expertise, obviously. And then I have another question: is BERT mandatory as of today for EU banks, and what is the final deadline for compliance? Well, BERT is not mandatory. It's voluntary to adopt, so you could just as well choose not to do it, which is also one of the reasons that the incentives to use it could potentially, need to be optimized, so that there are going to be banks that are more increasingly motivated to use it. But formally, there's no real requirement in this case, and there's no deadline associated for compliance. On the other hand, if you look at IREF, IREF is going to be mandatory to all European operating banks, and there are only some proportionality. Scope related change? Interpretations that the client can make, but that needs to be implemented. And IREF is going to be integrated in BERT from the start. So if a bank is going to implement IREF, I think it's sort of a no-brainer to see at that point in time whether or not BERT can accelerate and facilitate and smoothen out the implementation of IREF. But also that it's not mandatory.
Yeah, I don't see any new questions.
Okay. Well, cool. Then again, thanks for your attention, and hope you have a very good day.
Yeah, have a good
Thanks
day. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.